Talking about China, and of course we've read all this stuff about trying to punish the government for Scott Morrison's called rightly an international inquiry into the origins of the coronavirus. Now, our farmers are now being targeted. Remember earlier this week, China indicated it intended to impose a 73.6% tariff on Australian barley imports. Yesterday, it suspended meat imports from 4 Australian abattoirs, Beef City in Toowoomba, Dinmore at Ipswich, the Northern Cooperative Meat Company in Casino, and the Kilcoy Meatworks at Kilcoy. Ironically, the Kilcoy Meatworks is Chinese-owned. No doubt it was included in the ban to bolster China's claim that all this is trade-related rather than politically motivated. China claims the meat import suspensions have been imposed because of violations of customs and quarantine standards. That, of course, is rubbish. It claims its tariff on Australian barley has something to do with dumping. Well, on April 26, as you know, China's ambassador to Australia threatened a Chinese consumer boycott of Australian products because of the Morrison government's support for an inquiry into the origins of the coronavirus. Now, clearly that consumer boycott hasn't happened. So now the Chinese Communist government is imposing its own boycotts instead. The 4 abattoirs subjected to this trade ban represent 35% of Australia's beef exports to China. China has already moved to punish, as I said, Australia's barley exports in retaliation for Scott Morrison's call for an independent international inquiry into the origins of the coronavirus. So it's no wonder the meat and dairy industries are now nervous. I see the dairy industry has called a snap meeting with the federal government. Fears are growing over the possibility of a third Chinese trade strike aimed at Australian dairy exports. Now, we are the only nation to have 2 trade threats imposed on us by China since the beginning of the coronavirus pandemic. Dairy Connect Chief Executive Sean Morgan said, any threat to export markets is of deep concern to an agricultural industry. He said, we call on the federal government to do all in its power to ensure this doesn't happen. Now, there are also concerns, I have to say, that Australian wine exporters could be in China's sights. Wine shipments were held up at Chinese ports in 2018 after Australia introduced foreign interference laws and banned, remember, the Chinese telecommunications firm Huawei from the 5G network. So they've been down this track before. I don't know what the solution is to this appalling behaviour, but Australia can't be in the business of caving into these sorts of threats. George Christensen said in Parliament yesterday, and I quote, Australia is at a crossroads. We can keep giving in to Communist China's threats, or we can stand up for our sovereignty and our economic independence. He went on, with more than 36% of our exports being sold to China, representing 7.9% of GDP, it's clear we've put too many eggs in the one basket. China, he said, now own over 9.1 million hectares of our country, farms, factories, airports, resort islands, seaports, wind farms, solar farms and coal mines. He said they own more water than there is in Sydney Harbour, water that should be in the hands of Australian farmers. He said, being so entangled with an authoritarian regime has left our nation open to economic blackmail and boycotts, like that mooted by China's ambassador and the actions recently, he said, against both our barley and beef exports. He went on, the Parliament's Joint Standing Committee on Trade and Investment Growth has launched an inquiry looking into these and other matters. He said the inquiry is the Australian people's opportunity to have their say by making a submission to that inquiry. He said, we want to hear people's thoughts on our economic exposure to China, on foreign investment, and whether people think that the current economic relationship with China is harmful to the national interest. He said, it's time to speak up on China's economic infiltration and economic blackmail against our country. Enough is enough, said George Christensen. We must take a stand for our national sovereignty. Now, George Christensen is unafraid to speak out. He's the National Party MP for the federal seat of Dawson in North Queensland, a seat he's held since 2010, named, I might add, after Andrew Dawson, who was the Premier of Queensland from 1899 to 1903. And it takes in parts of the Burdekin Shire Council, the Mackay Regional Council, the Townsville City Council, and the Whitsunday Regional Council. He chairs this Federal Parliament Joint Standing Committee on Trade and Investment Growth. He has summons China's ambassador to appear before his Joint Standing Committee. I should say that under Article 31 of the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations. Diplomatic agents are, quote, not obliged to give evidence as a witness, so they won't turn up. But George Christensen kindly joins us tonight from Canberra. George, good evening. Thank you for being with Graham and with me. You've certainly not messed around here.
No.
You've described China's behaviour as a bastard act.
Well, it is a bastard act. I mean, and look, other people can go forward with all the diplomatic talk. I'm just going to call it out for what it is. It's too convenient, too much of a coincidence to say that the call by our Prime Minister and Foreign Minister, the right call for a global inquiry into the origins of the pandemic, and a few days later or a week later, we have bans on beef, bans or quotas on tariffs on barley. We've had the Chinese ambassador, as you've said, make the threats of a people's boycott over in China. These are not the actions of a reputable trading partner. They just simply aren't. And the inquiry that I have launched is all about ensuring that we aren't in this position for much longer, that we look at diversifying our trade base, our export base in particular, and we look at the problem of foreign investment, because we've got so much of Australian business, and I fear agribusiness particularly, that's owned by China.
You've said that China has just gone into full bullying. Hang on, I'll just come to Graham,
right.
And I'll come to you, Graham. Have just gone into full bullying, threatening and coercion mode. Are you convinced this is directly linked to the Prime Minister's international call for an inquiry into the origins of COVID-19? You simply say that China has questions to answer, because we do need a world inquiry, don't we?
China's got form on this sort of coercion when it comes to trade and mixing trade with politics. And look, I can point to another country. Australia's not alone. The Netherlands changed its de facto embassy in Taiwan to the Netherlands office in Taipei. They did that very recently, and China's response was, well, we send 90% of your medical supplies to your country, and we could put the kibosh on that. Again, yes. That is not the sort of action and behaviour of a reputable trading partner. Now, I know, look, a lot of industries do business with them. We've got to transition sensibly. But if we don't recognise right now that there is a problem, if we're going to sort of hide our eyes from it because, people are collecting a paycheck and getting a lot of money and a lot of profits out of the arrangement, we're never going to fix it. We are never going to fix it, because you're going to hear corporate Australia, like I heard today, come out and say stupid things like that our intelligence agencies, our security agencies are somehow harming our country economically. These are the sort of people that put their profits, the profit motive, before patriotism. They put the almighty dollar before their country, and I can't stand that.
Okay, Graham?
George, well, I was wondering, what about the dairy industry? Because we've allowed the Chinese some inroads into that, haven't we?
We have. I mean, and this is why I mention also foreign investment, because what we've got is China, their strategy is all about securing a supply chain back to their country. So they vertically integrate everything. They buy up the farmland, they buy up the water holdings. They've got more water holdings, over 730 billion litres of water, more water holdings than there is in Sydney Harbour in Australia, at a time when there's heaps of farmers out there that are suffering from drought. So they buy up the water holdings, buy up the land, buy up the processing, and then ship it all off to China. And you've got to ask, in that sort of equation, where's the national interest? Where's Australia's benefit in all of that? Because it's not only the milk going overseas, it's the profits and the taxes.
There's 2 plane loads of dairy produce go out of Tasmania every week to China, and Tasmania is now, all those dairy farms down there are owned by Chinese interests, all of them in Tasmania. Just one other thing, George.
I'd like to see the employment arrangements as well, to see who's working there.
That's right. But I just, on this issue, we're different from pre-coronavirus, aren't we? I mean, do you think there's also an overt attempt for China to gain a very significant strategic advantage in the world at a time right now when America and Europe and us are incapacitated economically.
Well, look, Alan, and some people will say I'll strap on the tinfoil hat, but I don't believe it's tinfoil at all. The fact is that we had something like 5 million people leave the city of Wuhan, the province of Hubei, to go all the way around the world at the same time that the Chinese Communist Party closed off its internal borders to ensure that those people that they knew were potentially infected with this rabid virus, weren't going to other parts of China. So they sort of fixed the problem, they corralled the problem for themselves and sent it across the world. And there's a lot of speculation, a lot of circumstantial evidence that they did that deliberately. And now, while the rest of the world's suffering economically, while I've got businesses that are going bust in the Whitsundays, tourism businesses, people whose life savings are just turned to ashes, quite frankly, China is powering along quite nicely. And you're going to say that's very, very convenient, isn't it? Very convenient. Yeah. I'm angry. I think that there's a lot of people in this country that are angry about that.
You said we should use the Port of Darwin as a bargaining chip. To quote your words, there are a lot of questions being raised now about the Port of Darwin. There is a clear clause in it that says at any point in time, if it is deemed to be a national security issue, that contract is null and void. Now, is this a national security issue? And should we say to them, well, listen, we'll void the contract for the Port of Darwin?
Well, look, the Trade Minister and the Foreign Minister have said we're not in a trade war. I take them at their word for that. They know far more about foreign affairs matters and trade matters than I do as a humble backbencher and chair of a committee. But, depends how far China wants to take this. If their actions start showing that actually they're not a friend here, they are an economic threat, then the questions do need to be asked about that port. I think it was a wrong decision in the first place, quite frankly, to lease that off to Landbridge, a company that had extensive links to the People's Liberation Army of China.
I can't believe, actually, George, that we ever made that decision. It seems to me to be a really, really bad one.
It was made by the Northern Territory Governor, Adam Giles, actually.
It's right. It's right. Very, very sadly, because I think Giles is a good bloke, but that was a bad decision.
He is a good bloke.
I'd be putting that on the bargaining table right now and say, hey guys, there's a clause in here we can operate, and if we don't get the beef and barley back pronto and stop talking about any other industries, we can actually take some action of our own. Then it is a trade war.
Let's get the guts of this.
Where we're at.
You've set up. Have you renamed this joint parliamentary probe to determine why China economically threatened Australia before and after the coronavirus pandemic? Have you blindsided cabinet ministers? Did you consult with them? I mean, it was previously known, I think, as an inquiry into diversifying Australia's trade and investment profile. Is this now known as the China inquiry?
Well, I'm calling it the China inquiry. I mean, blindsided's other people's words. I mean, what happened was here is that there's two ways a committee can go about getting an inquiry up. They can get it referred from a minister, that's the normal sort of process, or they can do a self-referred inquiry if they're harking back to some annual report of a department that's been presented to the government. So that's what I did. I went down that road. So this is an inquiry independent of the executive, and I think that's only right for the sensitive issues that we're dealing with. But this was an inquiry all about China from the get-go. Alan, Richo, some of the terms of reference, I won't go too much into it, but just hear them and you'll know it's China straight away. The inquiry is considering if Australia is too reliant on any one market for exports, considering factors that contribute to such dominance, the advantages and disadvantages of such. China makes up 36% of our overall international trade. It's clearly a consideration directly related to the People's Republic of China. Also in the foreign investment stage, can I say that we are looking at state-owned enterprises, and that clearly is in relation to China. So this is a China inquiry.
Yes, I mean, you've made the point, and look, no one's here. We've got to differentiate between the Chinese government and the Chinese people here. This is the Chinese government. And this bloke, Xi, everyone knew he was going to take China back 20 years instead of forward 20. You've just said enough is enough. You've said, and I'm quoting your words, we're going to stand up for Australia's sovereignty and economic independence against threats from communist China. So you want this to be a major look into communist China's, your words, economic infiltration of Australia, quote, through rampant foreign investment and export market dominance. Now, how do you envisage the public can contribute?
Well, through a couple of ways. I mean, the committee's got its own website for the inquiry. I think it's aph.gov.au/JSCTIG, Joint Standing Committee on Trade and Investment Growth. You can Google it as well. But I'll have a website set up. I don't want to force a whole heap of people there now, but the website's chinainquiry.com.au. It's not operational as yet. But this Friday, people can go there and look at all the information, make their own submissions to the inquiry through my website as well.
See, I mean, look, you've asked a very
Are you worried at all about... Oh, go on, Alan, you're right.
No, you go.
Well, Richard?
Look, I was just saying, are you worried about where this all ends? I mean, do you worry that we can offend the Chinese government to the point where they actually do take some retaliatory action?
I think they've already taken the retaliatory action. I think that I'm worried about where it leads because, I know that China's got form on this, but what's the other option? I mean, the Labor Party is out there, people like, Albanese and Penny Wong and others, Joel Fitzgibbon saying, we agree with the government on the inquiry into the origins of the pandemic, but we shouldn't be upsetting China. We've mishandled the relationship. There's only one way you handle the relationship other than how we're handling it, and that is you back down. You don't back down to bullies. You don't back down to someone that just keeps on kicking you. What you do is you speak up, you call it out for what it is, and you try and put measures in place to stop them from kicking you in the future. That's what my inquiry is all about.
See, what you said, what George Christensen has said,
potential.
Yeah, I mean, what George Christensen has said, I think, has great relevance. He just said yesterday, I'd like to know, and we talked about this last week on the program, George said, I'd like to know why state-owned and state-controlled Chinese firms, as well as visiting Chinese military, were raiding our supermarket shelves of medical supplies and other essentials. He said yesterday, I'd like to know what the real motivations are behind Communist China and its businesses buying up strategic Australian land, agribusiness and assets. He said, are they doing it for profit or to get a closed supply chain that's in China's interests and not ours? And then, of course, you've got China signalling all these threats that it would make. Just coming back to Graham's question there, George, just finally before we go, where does this end up?
Well, hopefully it ends up in policy changes and a change of direction economically to ensure that we are truly economically independent and that we have national sovereignty that we can keep rather than kowtowing to a ruthless dictatorship and an authoritarian regime that simply acts like we're a vassal state. We are not a vassal state. We're an independent nation. We're Australia, damn it. And we're not going to be browbeaten time and time again on foreign policy or any other policy matter by China just because of trade. But we need to take the measures to ensure that
just before we go,
our people in the future.
Okay, just before we go, George, one question then. Are we too dependent on China to service our debt? And are we too dependent on China to have to purchase those things we need here that we have surrendered? We've got no manufacturing industry. We're getting all this stuff. Is China propping up our economy, and is that likely to intimidate a response by the Australian government?
Well, China's certainly upped the ante on investment in Australia, and it certainly captured our export markets, that's for sure. But there is a way out of it. I don't believe that you just throw in the towel because we're so intertwined at the moment. There is a way out of it, but it's going to come to the right policy responses. They are being made. The government is looking at diversification. My committee inquiry is going to help. The government is looking at bolstering domestic manufacturing. The Leveris inquiry, that task force that's working at the moment, is going to do wonders. And hats off to Karen Andrews, for the Industries Minister, for putting that forward. We are going to reposition ourselves that we have a greater degree of self-sufficiency and diversification so that this problem that we're facing right now is not a problem for the Australian people in the future.